So on Tuesday, I think we left the discussion about decolonization. And some of the places in which decolonization and independence were beginning to manifest. And so we shall conclude that discussion and then briefly look at what happens. So we have been looking at the first part of the Cold War, so 1945 to about 1961. And so the second part of this is looking at the Cold War from 1961 onwards. Now, I should probably mention that from 1961 onwards we see lots of countries becoming independent, but we also see a shift in global politics. And the way we see it is in places like Rhodesia, where apartheid, minority white rule was pretty much what was going on. In South Africa, where the actual apartheid was going on. But many countries become independent in the 1960s, and so this is still during the Cold War, and the question is, how do the major powers react to independence? We briefly mentioned, for example, that the United States was constantly called out because of one, its racial practices, segregation, but also for supporting countries, its allies that still had colonies. In fact, this actually leads to the U.S. Getting involved in a conflict that was essentially maybe a war of independence. So if you think about Vietnam, and so here's the insidious thing about Vietnam. So the French take over Vietnam in about 1884. That's when they officially colonize Vietnam. In 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated, Ho Chi Minh actually went to Paris and sought audience with Woodrow Wilson. Now, we have mentioned that Woodrow Wilson was, he didn't even hide his racism and his thoughts about people who are not white. But so Ho Chi Minh didn't get a chance to speak with Woodrow Wilson, and what he had been agitating for was Vietnamese independence. And so if you sort of think about Germany's colonies being taken after the loss of the war, some of these countries or some of these colonized peoples didn't want to be transferred to another colonial power. And so Ho Chi Minh, these are actually, and I mentioned that I do not quote communists, but this is what he actually wrote. And so if we go back all the way to the French Revolution, it was about equality, liberty, and brotherhood. And so he's really throwing the French declarations words into the French sort of way of doing things. But again, remember we mentioned that de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle. So Charles de Gaulle was the, during the Second World War, he eventually became the leader of the Free French. So the French were sort of split into two. There was the Vichy French, who were sort of allied with Germany. Actually, they were allied with Germany and did a lot of what the Germans wanted them to do, including like rounding up Jewish people. And then there were the Free French. So de Gaulle was part of the Free French, and he, well, so he wanted France to be liberated from the Nazis, but after liberation, he decides he's going to reconstitute the French Empire. Because again, the British did not lose their empire, so the French. Now, I don't know that he knew that the fundamentals of power had shifted from Europe to the US and the USSR, but so he wanted to reconstitute the French Empire and bring about a new, what he called a glorious Fourth Republic. But still, Lebanon and Syria become independent, even as France is still trying to keep all its, particularly in the Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And so Ho Chi Minh in 1947 declares independence. So again, this is 2 years after the end of the Second World War. So he declares independence in Vietnam. Also remember, he's a communist because that's who was helping him to fight for independence. So he declares independence in 1947, and the French are like, no, you're not independent. And so war breaks out. So the French eventually get defeated in 1954 at Bien Dien Phu. This is, so Bien Dien Phu is sort of like the biggest egg on the French face. Like, you're the French, you have US support, but you are defeated by the Vietnamese. But what the French do is they remind the United States that in 1783, they came to help the US. You might remember American independence, 1776, but then the British are like, nah, you're not independent, and we are going to fight you. Washington and Rochambeau coming to fight Cornwallis, and Cornwallis surrender in Yorktown. So history kind of, if you have friends, sometimes they will ask for your help. But so the US was told that they were fighting communism because it is true that Ho Chi Minh was a communist. And so, yeah, the US is like, we have this doctrine of containment, and so we are going to contain the expansion of communism everywhere. So, yeah, that's what they kind of do. Now, after 1954, there was actually what was called the Geneva Accords. And so the French kind of agreed to give French Indochina independence, even though it's kind of like, you've been defeated, you're not giving people independence, you are defeated. That's what happened. But so Vietnam was divided into two: North Vietnam, which was communist, and you can see it borders China, and South Vietnam, which was theoretically capitalist democratic state. I did mention one of Diem's killing of or persecuting Buddhists because he was a Catholic. And so the US is like, we are supporting you, but you're persecuting Buddhists, and that is not a good thing. But so again, we see the US involvement from 1954. The US sends advisors to South Vietnam and then increases its presence. Eventually, it has troops in Vietnam. Yeah, and so Vietnam is divided into two, but then according Diem's presidency was a stain on the US because, again, you are supporting someone who persecutes Buddhists, and you say that there's freedom in South Vietnam. So by about 1967, the US had 500,000 troops in fighting in Vietnam. And so, the actual incident that brought about US participation in the Vietnam War is the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, it was said that the North Vietnamese PT boats attacked U.S. destroyers. And so, there was the Gulf of Tonkin incident. That's the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And then there was a resolution where Congress authorized Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, to go to war with North Vietnam. Now, if you look at this map, it kind of gives you an idea of the difficulty the U.S. faced in fighting in Vietnam. So the 1954 Vietnam is divided into two, the North and the South, but the North is still trying to get to infiltrate the South. But when the war begins, North Vietnamese communist, who the U.S. called Viet Cong, would go through Laos and Cambodia to get to South Vietnam. And there was really no way to stop them from doing that. Now, this is one of the destroyers that was attacked, apparently. So two destroyers, Maddox and Tana Joy. And so this is kind of a map of what the destroyers were doing, but also you see they're kind of approaching North Vietnam. And so this is what sparks the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, there's a question, and I mentioned this when we discussed Cuba. So the U.S. invasion of Cuba in 1898 came about because a U.S. ship blew up. Now, some people say, so the USS Maine, some people say that the Americans blew up the ship, so they had a reason to go to war. I mean, sometimes, like, there are people who believe 9/11 was something else. But so later on, there was a question of, did the Vietnamese even attack the U.S.? And so this is what eventually Johnson says, that, they were probably shooting at whales. It wasn't clear that anyone attacked them. But so that led to the Gulf of Tonkin incident and declaration. I am going to show you a terrible image next that depicts what some of the reasons the U.S. supported DMs being kicked out of power. Remember, during Kennedy. So, and you probably have seen videos circulating maybe of last week, where someone set themselves on fire. People kind of do use this as a strategy to highlight some issue. So if you sort of think about the Arab Spring, we shall probably not talk about the Arab Spring, but if you think about the Arab Spring, the gentleman set himself on fire because he was being harassed. This picture is called the burning monk. He set himself on fire, and then he just sat there and burned to death. So he was highlighting the government's oppression of the Buddhists. I think this was in 1961, and so the U.S. was like, DM, you have to stop persecuting Buddhists. DM did not stop, and so he was overthrown. But the U.S. then gets involved in Vietnam. And some of the, if you've seen photos from Iraq, Abu Ghraib, maybe you haven't, where the U.S. was, some U.S. soldiers were piling people into like a human pyramid. So the U.S. sometimes supports people who are sketchy, very sketchy. And so this is an example. So this gentleman is about to get shot, and he was accused of being being Viet Cong. This was the intelligence person in South Vietnam. And so the US government's story was that we are fighting communism. But then this picture was published, and apparently the US Americans were like, we are supporting this, we are supporting executions on the street. So this, if you think about media and war, this, by the way, he came to live in Virginia and died in 1998, which is sort of like, shouldn't he have been tried for like war crimes or something? Now, I apologize for this picture, but I think sometimes pictures tell more than words. This is, so the picture is generally called the Napalm Girl. The girl in the picture was, so this is South Vietnam. Napalm is used in bombs, and it's kerosene and a mixture of like explosives. So it lights up, but it also sticks to your body. So this is what had just happened. So you can see the cloud behind there. And so her clothes were on fire, and so she just took them off, and this picture was taken in that moment. Now, the good news is that she survived. She's still alive somewhere in, I think she lives in Canada. But so the idea that the South Vietnamese, so this napalm bomb was dropped by the South Vietnamese on South Vietnamese. And so again, this is published, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And then Americans are asking, wait, we are supporting the bombing of children? And so eventually the Vietnam War is going to become very, very contentious. In fact, some students, you probably have heard of students protesting about Palestine and all of that stuff going on. So 1970, students were protesting the Vietnam War. Lots of protests. And a few students were actually killed. 4 students at Kent, I think Kent University in the Midwest. And so, yeah, there was increasing disagreement with what the US was doing in Vietnam. I would recommend that you maybe watch a bit of an old movie called or titled Air America. Stars Robert Downey Jr. before he was Iron Man. But he kind of depicts some of the things that were going on in Vietnam, including the smuggling of cocaine back to the US. And yeah, it's terrible. Anyway, so really, the war in Vietnam was about independence, but the US got in and was kind of pulled into something that was. So then there were other countries that became independent. But actually, if you sort of think about 1960, these were the countries in Africa that were not colonies. So Ghana won its independence in 1957, and it was really the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. So South Africa declared independence in 1910 from the British, but then that was a minority government. Liberia was never colonized. Egypt became semi-free in 1922. Eritrea in 1961, I think. Libya in the 1950s. So the sub-Saharan Africa, by 1957, majority of it was still colonized. But so we begin to see movements towards decolonization. So for example, in Algeria, now, so here's my sort of conspiracy. France, I think I've been there once, maybe twice. France is I think, pretends to be a major power. It has a lot of influence in West Africa, but I don't know that absent colonization or absent the history of colonization, it would be important. Now, France was a bad colonizer, one that didn't want to give up its colonies. So, for example, Algeria. Now, again, sort of think about the sequence of these events. Vietnam declares declares independence in 1947. The French say no, and then they fight until 1954. In 1954 onwards, the Algerian Front for National Liberation decides that Algeria should become independent. Again, Tunisia is independent, in Morocco, and so Algeria is like, why are we not independent? Now, the French really wanted to keep Algeria. Like, they did not want to give it up. Now, if you think about, so this up there is Portugal, but to the northeast is France. So it's sort of like, a really stone throw away. And so the French really wanted to keep Algeria, but the war of and part of the reason was to avoid the humiliation they suffered in Indochina with Vietnam. But eventually about 1 million people die in the Algerian Liberation War. Algeria becomes independent in 1962, so the French kind of really don't get to keep Algeria. Most of the colonies. But the other French colonies in Africa get independence about 1960, so I don't even know why they wanted to keep Algeria. Now, so this other, so I briefly mentioned Ghana. Ghana's independence was actually very instrumental because, and when Kwame Nkrumah, the first Ghanaian president, comes to the US to attend the United Nations General Assembly annual meeting. So again, this is maybe this is the second head of a black majority country. So I'm thinking Haiti. But so he comes to New York and people are lining the streets to see him. But he actually spent some time at Lincoln University and then went to the UK. He was one of the leading Pan-Africanists, and so including presidency of, for example, African Students Association Organization of the US, and he was also one of the conveners of the Pan-African Congresses, and so he really was the key figure in Ghanaian independence. So he actually begins with a campaign of positive action, nonviolent protests, but eventually he was actually jailed in 1952. But by 1957, he had become the president. So that was the first, independent sub-Saharan African country. But so part of what he also did as former British colonies, and this is just super weird. The British did not hold on to the colonies in some direct way, other than Rhodesia and South Africa. They gave their colonies independence later than the French, but they also created this group that is called the Commonwealth, which has about 50 countries. And so the view of independent African nations was, you colonized us, now we are free, and you want us to join another organization that you lead. But so Ghana actually set the pace for some of these things. So Nkrumah was actually a bit of a socialist, but he also hoped to industrialize. Eventually, he is overthrown in coup in 1967, ironically, he was visiting Vietnam when he was overthrown, which is now. So when we think about liberation, there were places where it occurred without violence, and there were places where it occurred with violence. And so, for example, in Kenya, the British established colonial rule in 1895. But again, you can see sort of like in the 1900s, there was resistance, particularly in the sort of northwest areas of the map. But again, like in Ghana, where you see the emergence of one leader, we see the emergence of Jomo Kenyatta, who actually goes to Britain for a while and begins to petition for independence, comes back to Kenya and the Kenya colony. And so he didn't actually lead the armed resistance that was known as the Mau Mau, but he was associated with it. He was jailed for 7 years, but eventually he becomes president. Now, we briefly mentioned Congo, the Belgians. Congo was an interesting case of decolonization. It held, still does hold lots of mineral reserves. In fact, if you own a cell phone, it probably has some mineral from the Congo. So that is something to maybe. So Congo was important in that context. But again, we previously mentioned the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, because he was trying to go a different way. Like he wanted to nationalize mines and other things. And so eventually he is killed, Lumumba, and then the person who takes over was Mobutu Sese Seko. He called himself, well, he called himself many things, including the rooster that. Anyway, Congo becomes independent in 1960 and goes through some of those challenges, including the part where Katanga secedes. So Katanga is probably the richest mineral region in the Congo, and so it secedes, and part of what Dag Hammarskjöld was doing when his plane was in a crash was to try to bring peace. But there was, Belgians were still involved even after independence. They take Lumumba to Katanga, the secessionist part, and then they actually kill him. So again, you begin to see the challenges of